My son stood in the hospital corridor, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Mom, I'm dying. You're the only match." I looked at this stranger who shared my blood but had abandoned my heart 20 years ago, and I said the hardest word of my life: no. The doctors gasped, the nurses looked away, but they didn't know what he had done to me. My name is Susan Martinez, and at 60 years old, I was being asked to save the life of someone who had nearly destroyed mine. The fluorescent lights of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles cast harsh shadows on Jason's gaunt face, making him look even more like the ghost he'd been for 2 decades. His liver was failing, cirrhosis from years of alcohol abuse, hepatitis C from needles I didn't want to think about, and now complete organ failure that gave him weeks, maybe days to live. I was his only hope, the tests had confirmed. My liver was healthy, my blood type matched perfectly, and I was young enough to survive the donation. But surviving and living are 2 different things, and Jason had taught me that difference 20 years ago. The reunion, if you could call it that, had happened 3 weeks earlier. I was working in my garden in Silver Lake, tending to the roses that had become my children after my real ones abandoned me. The doorbell rang, which was unusual. Most people knew I preferred them to come around back. When I opened the door, I saw a skeletal man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit, his skin the yellow-green of dying leaves. It took me a full 10 seconds to recognize my own son. Behind him stood 3 people who would become central to this nightmare. His wife, Patricia, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes who looked at my house like an appraiser. His teenage daughter, Emma, who had my nose and my mother's chin, but looked at me like I was a stranger. And Marcus, Jason's younger brother, my other son, who I hadn't seen in 15 years, but who had at least had the decency to call occasionally. "Mom," Jason said, and the words sounded foreign in his mouth, like he was speaking a language he'd forgotten. "I'm sick. I need your help." The audacity of it, showing up after 20 years with no apology, no explanation, just need. Pure, desperate need. I should have closed the door then. Instead, I let them in, and that's when the real torture began. Patricia took charge immediately, sitting in my living room like she owned it, explaining Jason's condition with clinical detachment. End-stage liver disease, multiple organ dysfunction. The transplant list would take years he didn't have, but family members could donate living tissue. Up to 60% of a liver could be removed, and both donor and recipient could survive. "Could survive," I repeated, looking at Jason, who couldn't meet my eyes. "That's optimistic." "The success rate is very high," Patricia said smoothly, pulling out pamphlets she'd clearly prepared, "and Jason is still young enough to have an excellent prognosis post-transplant." Young? He was 42, but looked 60. The drugs and alcohol had carved deep lines into his face, turned his hair gray, made his hands shake with a permanent tremor. This wasn't the beautiful boy I'd raised, who'd played violin in the youth orchestra, who'd graduated summa cum laude from UCLA. This was what remained after 20 years of self-destruction. "Why should I?" asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. The room went silent. Emma looked shocked. Clearly no one had told her the family history. Marcus stared at the floor, remembering. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But Jason? Jason finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not remorse, but expectation. He still believed I owed him something. "Because you're my mother," he said simply, as if that bond hadn't been severed by his own hands. I stood up, my 60-year-old knees protesting. "I was your mother when you pushed me down the stairs and broke my ribs. I was your mother when you stole $30,000 from my retirement account. I was your mother when you sold my mother's jewelry, pieces that had survived the Holocaust, for drug money. I was your mother when you stood in this very room and told me I was dead to you, that you wished I'd never been born. Where was this mother-son bond then?" Emma gasped. Patricia's calculated composure cracked. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night 20 years ago when Jason, high on methamphetamine and rage, had destroyed our family. "I was sick," Jason said weakly. "The addiction—" "The addiction didn't make you cruel," I interrupted. "It just revealed who you really were. The addiction didn't make you tell me that Dad killed himself because of me, when we both know it was because he couldn't watch you destroy yourself anymore. The addiction didn't make you show up at his funeral and scream that I should have been the one in the coffin. The memories flooded back, each one a fresh wound. Eduardo, my husband, hanging in the garage after Jason had stolen from him one too many times. The funeral where Jason, high and vicious, had turned Eduardo's death into a weapon against me. The night he'd pushed me down the stairs, standing over my broken body and rifling through my purse while I gasped for breath. The months of physical therapy, learning to walk again while he disappeared with everything valuable I owned. People change, Patricia interjected, trying to salvage the situation. Jason's been sober for 3 years. 3 years, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 years out of 20, and only because his liver finally gave out, forcing sobriety on him. Not because he chose it, not because he felt remorse, because his body wouldn't let him continue. Marcus finally spoke up. Mom, I know what he did was unforgivable, but he's still your son. He's still my brother, Emma's father. Doesn't that mean something? I looked at Marcus, my younger son, who had fled to New York the moment he turned 18, who had watched Jason's violence from the safety of distance. He had called occasionally, sent Christmas cards, maintained the pretense of family from 3,000 miles away. But he had never come back, never helped, never stood between Jason and me during those terrible years. It means something, I agreed. It means I spent 9 months creating a life that would spend 20 years trying to destroy mine. It means I have nightmares about my own child. It means that when the doctors told me I had PTSD, it wasn't from a war or an accident. It was from my son. Emma, who had been silent, finally spoke. But Grandma, if you don't help him, he'll die. I looked at this child, 16 years old, with my genetics but none of my memories. She was innocent in this, a victim of carefully edited family history. Sweet girl, I said gently, your father died for me 20 years ago. What's lying in that hospital bed is just the consequence of his choices catching up with him. The tests happened anyway. Patricia had power of attorney and pushed for them, hoping to guilt me into compliance. The results were devastating for them. I was indeed a perfect match. Better than perfect. My liver was healthy, my blood work ideal, my antibodies compatible. The transplant team was eager, excited even. Living donor liver transplants had a high success rate. I could save him. The pressure began immediately. Patricia called daily, sometimes hourly. Marcus flew in from New York, setting up camp in my guest room, working on me with gentle persistence. Even Emma was deployed, showing up with photo albums Patricia had found somewhere, pictures of Jason as a baby, as a young boy, before the darkness took him. But the worst was when they brought in Dr. Sarah Kim, the transplant psychiatrist whose job was to ensure donors were making free and informed choices. She was kind, professional, and completely unprepared for my story. Mrs. Martinez, she said during our third session, I need to understand your reluctance. Are you afraid of the surgery itself? No, I replied. I'm afraid of saving someone who tried to kill me. She blinked, her professional composure wavering. Could you elaborate? So I did. I told her about the stairs, about the theft, about the emotional torture that preceded the physical violence. I told her about the restraining order I'd had to get, which Jason had violated 3 times. I told her about moving houses twice to escape him, changing my phone number countless times, living in fear for years even after he disappeared. He's been sober for 3 years, Dr. Kim said, echoing Patricia's words. Hitler was a vegetarian, I replied. That didn't make him a good person. She made notes, lots of notes. Later, I learned she had recommended against the transplant, stating that the psychological trauma to the donor would be significant and potentially dangerous. But Patricia hired lawyers, claimed I was being coerced by my own trauma, that I wasn't mentally competent to make this decision. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Patricia's lawyers painted me as a vindictive mother punishing a sick child for past mistakes. My lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Chen who took the case pro bono, painted the truth. A survivor being asked to sacrifice herself for her abuser. The courtroom was packed the day of the hearing. Somehow the media had gotten wind of it. Mother refuses to save dying son, made for sensational headlines. Protesters gathered outside, some calling me a monster, others calling me brave. Inside, I sat quietly while my life was dissected, my trauma displayed for public consumption. Jason was brought in on a wheelchair, an IV attached, looking every bit the dying victim. He played it perfectly, weak, remorseful, desperate. He even cried when he looked at me, though I knew those tears were as calculated as everything else he did. Patricia testified about their life together, their struggles, his redemption. She painted a picture of a reformed man, a loving father, someone who deserved a second chance. She didn't mention the 2 restraining orders his ex-girlfriends had against him, or the assault charges that had been mysteriously dropped, or the fact that Emma lived with Patricia's parents most of the time because Jason's temper, even sober, was unpredictable. Marcus testified too, torn between loyalty to his brother and the truth he'd witnessed. He chose a middle ground, acknowledging the past but emphasizing the present need. Whatever happened before, he said, Jason is dying now. That's what matters. Emma wasn't allowed to testify, being a minor, but she sat in the gallery, her eyes moving between her dying father and the grandmother she'd never really known. I saw myself in her, another generation of women who would carry the scars of violent men who shared their blood. When it was my turn to testify, Jennifer had advised me to be calm, factual, clinical. Instead, I was honest. Your Honor, I began, I've been asked to give 60% of my liver to save my son's life. At my age, this surgery carries a 30% risk of serious complications and a 5% risk of death. I'm being asked to risk my life for someone who tried to take it 20 years ago. I pulled out the photos Jennifer had submitted as evidence. My body after the fall down the stairs, purple and broken. The hospital records showing multiple fractures, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury that still affected my memory. The police reports, the restraining orders, the documentation of years of abuse. But more than the physical risk, I continued, I'm being asked to give life to someone who made mine not worth living. Jason didn't just hurt me physically. He killed his father with his cruelty. Eduardo hung himself rather than watch Jason destroy our family further. He terrorized his younger brother into fleeing across the country. He stole not just money, but peace, safety, the ability to trust and love freely. Jason tried to speak then, to object or plead, but his lawyer quieted him. I've been told people change, I said, looking directly at him, that addiction is a disease, that he deserves forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it doesn't mean enabling, and it certainly doesn't mean sacrificing my life for someone who valued it so little. The judge, an older woman named Teresa Gonzalez, listened carefully. When I finished, she asked one question. Mrs. Martinez, if the situations were reversed, if you needed an organ and Jason was the only match, do you believe he would donate? I looked at Jason, really looked at him. Even dying, even desperate, there was still that calculating look in his eyes, that assessment of what he could gain. No, I said simply, he wouldn't. The courtroom erupted. Patricia screamed that I was lying, that I was murdering my own son. Marcus put his head in his hands. Emma ran out crying. Jason just stared at me with those hollow eyes, and for a moment I saw the monster he'd always been, furious that his victim wouldn't save him one more time. Judge Gonzalez ruled that same day. She stated that no one could be compelled to donate an organ, that bodily autonomy was absolute, and that given the documented history of abuse, forcing me to undergo this procedure would constitute a violation of my rights and potentially cause severe psychological harm. Patricia immediately announced they would appeal, but Jason didn't have time for appeals. He was moved to hospice care 2 days later. Marcus begged me to reconsider, just once more. He brought Emma, who sobbed and pleaded, this innocent child caught in the crossfire of generational trauma. If I do this, I told Marcus privately, if I save him, what message does that send? That you can destroy someone's life and they'll still sacrifice themselves for you? That abuse is forgivable if you're family? That victims owe their abusers salvation? But what message does it send if you don't? Marcus asked, tears in his eyes. That choices have consequences, I replied. That you can't burn bridges and expect them to reappear when you need to cross back over. That some things, once broken, can't be fixed with guilt or manipulation, or even death. Jason died on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after showing up at my door. Patricia called me herself, her voice void of its usual calculation. "He's gone," she said simply. "I hope you're satisfied." "I'm not satisfied," I told her. "I'm not happy. I'm not relieved. I'm just done. I've been done for 20 years. The funeral was small. I didn't attend, though Marcus did. Emma sent me a letter afterward, angry and hurt, calling me a murderer. I saved that letter, not out of cruelty, but as a reminder that trauma is generational, that the victims of abuse extend beyond the immediate target. 6 months later, Marcus called. He'd been seeing a therapist, processing not just Jason's death, but their childhood, the violence he'd witnessed, the guilt he carried for escaping. "I understand now," he said quietly. "Jason died long before his liver failed. He died the day he chose violence over family." "No," I corrected him. "He died the day he enjoyed it." I still live in Silver Lake, still tend my roses. The media attention has died down, though occasionally someone recognizes me as that mother who let her son die. Some call me heartless, others call me strong. I don't care what they call me. I know what I am. A survivor who refused to be victimized one more time. The liver I didn't give Jason is still healthy, still functioning, still keeping me alive to tend my garden, to volunteer at the domestic violence shelter, to speak at support groups for other mothers whose children became their abusers. I tell them what I wish someone had told me, that DNA is not a suicide pact, that giving birth to someone doesn't mean owing them your life, that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable destruction. Emma reached out again on her 18th birthday. She wanted to understand, she said. She wanted to know the grandmother she'd been taught to hate. We meet now, occasionally, in neutral spaces. I tell her stories about Jason before the darkness, the violin recitals, the science fairs, the bright, beautiful boy who was murdered by the man he became. She's beginning to understand that I didn't refuse to save her father. I refused to sacrifice myself for someone who had already killed the son I loved. Patricia remarried within a year to a wealthy developer who probably doesn't know the full story. Marcus and I have slowly rebuilt our relationship, founded on truth rather than obligation. He tells me Jason haunts him sometimes, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of what he could have become if he'd stayed, if he'd been weaker, if he'd let the family violence consume him too. And me? I'm 61 now, alive and whole, with all my organs intact. Every morning I wake up grateful that I said no, that I chose myself over my abuser, even though that abuser came from my own body. The scar from the stairs still aches when it rains, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. But I'm here to feel that ache, to tend my roses, to live the life Jason tried to steal. Some might say I killed my son by refusing to save him. But the truth is simpler and sadder. Jason killed himself 20 years ago with his first act of violence, his first theft, his first cruel word designed to wound. His liver just took 2 decades to catch up with his soul. I don't regret saying no. I regret that I was put in a position where no was the only answer that honored the woman Jason tried to destroy. The woman who, against all odds, survived to make that choice.